falls to me to introduce our key speaker of the night, Tim Soutphommasane. Tim has a PhD from Oxford. He has an MPhil from the University of Sydney, no Monash law degree, but still reasonably impressive, I think. He was appointed the Race Discrimination Commissioner in August of 2013, and during his term, Tim has faced an attempt by the Attorney General to drastically water down protections of the Race Discrimination Act, and he was instrumental in winning that fight through the power of clear advocacy and open debate. Now, he faces an environment when fear and suspicion on the basis of race and religion are being whipped up under the banner of terrorism and national security. And to serve as the Race Discrimination Commissioner in these circumstances, surely Tim is the very embodiment of the supposed old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Except that when I googled that today, I learned that, perhaps fittingly, it turns out that that phrase is not Chinese at all, and is in fact a paternalistic invention of the English speakers who were trying to add some mystique to their phrase. So even more appropriate than I thought it was. We are very fortunate indeed to have Tim Soutphommasane as our keynote speaker tonight, at a time when racism is so central to the public discourse. So please join me in welcoming Race Discrimination Commissioner Dr. Tim Soutphommasane.
Well, thank you very much, Adam, and I commend you on your impeccable pronunciation. As for you, Claire, do you not know that Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act is alive and well? You mock me at your peril. But friends, I'm absolutely delighted to be with you this evening, because these are challenging times for friends of human rights. And at times like these, it's important that we take time to enjoy each other's friendship and fellowship, but also draw strength and inspiration from each other. So I'm absolutely thrilled to lend my support to the Castan Centre tonight. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, members of the Castan family, judges, former judges, Senator Penny Wright, and friends. During the past year or so, there have been two questions that I've been asked with unerring predictability. One, should the Racial Discrimination Act be amended? Two, how is everyone getting along at the Australian Human Rights Commission? Someone even asked me that very question tonight before dinner. Well, being among friends of human rights, you've all heard what needs to be said about the RDA. Few provisions of federal legislation have been as widely debated as Section 18C. As for that second question, it's fair to say that my fellow commissioners and I are deeply flattered by the interest. If there's anything worse than being talked about, it's not being talked about at all. And personally, can I say how touched I've been to find so much interest in the collegiality of the Commission. It really does show that you care. It is true that we have some differences. Some of us favour the blue ties that are currently in fashion. Some of us favour the red ties. As recent appearances on Classic FM's midday interview reveal, we also do not necessarily share musical tastes. But, lest you all get too excited about where we diverge, you should all know this. We all share a love of liberty. The milk of freedom is sweet. And freedom is at the heart of my work on matters of racial discrimination. But it's not freedom as an abstract ideal. It's not freedom as an undergraduate one-word slogan. Freedom does not exist in a vacuum. There's a reason why it's liberty, equality, fraternity, and why it's not liberty, liberty, liberty. Freedom for me means this. I believe that people should be free to express their identity, should be free to live with dignity, should be free to participate in our national life as an equal. Everyone has a right to be free from the effects of bigotry and from the social tyranny of discrimination. This year saw a victory for those of us who believe in this kind of freedom. Communities, advocates, citizens stood united, and we defeated the proposition that Australians had a right to be bigots. The Prime Minister made the right decision in abandoning his government's proposed repeal of Section 18C because the mood of change was inconsistent with our values. Australians are emphatically committed to racial tolerance, and there remains no good reason to be repealing laws that represent our commitment to civility and tolerance. Nor is there any cause to be changing laws that have operated as they were intended to for almost 20 years. Let's remember the history behind Part 2A of the Racial Discrimination Act. These provisions were introduced as a response to the recommendation of 3 major reports and inquiries, including the National Inquiry into Racist Violence conducted by my predecessor R.A. Moss and her distinguished co-commissioner Ron Castan. The inquiry noted that targets of racial violence or harassment had little recourse to existing civil remedies under common law. Among other things, the inquiry recommended that the RDA be amended to prohibit racist harassment. The rationale for Part 2A, though, was clear. Racial vilification provisions were required because racial abuse and harassment can escalate to racial violence. It was important that the law step in. And it is essential that the law continues to play this role. The law stands, in part, to reflect our values as a society. It exists to set a standard. One of the dangers of repealing or weakening racial vilification laws is that it could well have the effect of emboldening people to deal out racial abuse with impunity, to believe that their freedom of speech, even if exercised with the intent of wounding, must trump the freedom of another. The prominence of classical liberal ideas about free speech has been a curious feature of the contest over the RDA. It said, for example, that the law should play no role in regulating speech, that laws prohibiting racial vilification involve a form of state censorship. If there's racist speech, we should put our faith in good forms of speech to combat it. Let us expose racist bigotry to the disinfectant of sunlight. Let ridicule and social criticism do the job. That's the argument. Well, it's true that good speech can overcome bad speech. It can. But what about those situations when it doesn't? What if someone from a marginal or vulnerable position cannot speak back? These are not questions that come naturally to those who are accustomed to enjoying social power and privilege. There's another thing too. The idea of flushing out racism may sound good in theory, but I'm not so sure it's so simple in practice. I, for one, have yet to hear anyone who has been subjected to racial abuse who say that they are grateful for having had the experience. Few targets of abuse would celebrate their experience for having brought out bigotry and racism out into the open. Most would prefer for it never to have happened. With so-called classical liberal arguments, I believe we are seeing at work the ethos that has been described as homeopathic machismo. The notion that a tincture of poison will lift us to heights of tolerance. Now, this ethos may make sense for the spectator who's had the benefit of being insulated from social violence. For this spectator, seeing the real and ugly face of racism for the first time may well leave them with a new understanding of the harm that prejudice can inflict. However, not all spectators will be of this sort. I don't think we should be revelling in exposing people to bouts of bigotry. Further, we must not make the mistake of forgetting about the people who are the targets and victims of vilification. Because if we are talking about lifting people to new heights of tolerance, we shouldn't forget that the burden of lifting doesn't fall on everyone equally. In this respect, it is true, not all of us are lifters. There's a slightly different way of explaining this. We are perhaps seeing the emergence in our political culture of a particular aesthetic understanding of freedom, one that elevates racism into a strangely sublime experience. Edmund Burke once explained the sublime the following way: if pain is not carried to violence, and terror is not conversant about the present destruction of the person, they are capable of producing delight. Not pleasure, but a sort of delightful horror, a sort of tranquility tinged with terror, which, as it belongs to self-preservation, is one of the strongest of all passions. I think the classical liberal approach to free speech and race reflects such thinking. It explains why classical liberals believe only physical violence warrants the attention of the law. And it explains why we hear from them a lot about the freedom to unleash bigotry, but not much at all about the freedom of those subjected to such delightful horror. In our current debates, we've also seen this sensibility towards the sublime in discussions about patriotism. There have been more muscular demands of late that people make declarations of their national loyalty. Last week, for example, some commentators were enraged by a decision taken by Woolworths to remove from their shelves t-shirts that boasted "Australia, love it or leave." During the past few months, there's been considerable debate as well about the term Team Australia and whether that term involves a subtle form of racism. I say this: we should be clear about our language. There is, as it were, very little to be gained from using the word racism without discrimination. Patriotism is not the same as racism. To love your country needn't mean that you subscribe to notions of racial superiority or that you believe some racial or ethnic groups cannot belong to your society. So, in the case of those love it or leave t-shirts, many of us, myself included, may not like the idea of an aggressive or swaggering patriotism, but we shouldn't make the mistake of believing that that's the only kind of patriotism possible. Some of us may also question the use of Team Australia, but it makes little sense to dismiss this as racist. The phrase merely begs the question: is Team Australia just shorthand for an Australian liberal democratic community? Or is it supposed to mean something else? Yes, patriotism may have its aggressive expressions, but it can also be something else. It can be something generous and uplifting. It can be critical and questioning and not just quiescent. If we love our country, we will seek to improve it. We will want it to live up to the best of its traditions rather than succumbing to its worst. A virtuous patriotism isn't blind parochialism, but rather an expression of citizenship and humane commitment. To be sure, many of us may not be comfortable with patriotism, certainly not as friends of human rights. Our work our attention is directed at the universal. Even international standards, however, require domestic expression. The universal requires the particular. As citizens, we must not surrender the language of patriotism, not least at a time when some may be calling for the limitation of freedoms by directly appealing to patriotic sentiment. Now, more than ever, we need to reflect on how a love of country can direct our energies towards liberty rather than tyranny. Given rising anxieties about terrorism, anxieties underlined today by the troubling events in Canada, we have many reasons to be vigilant. But that vigilance also extends to fear, suspicion, and division. Our society is best placed to respond to any threat through unity. Today, those in positions of leadership have a special duty to ensure calm and proportion, to avoid inflaming community sentiment. Well, on this measure, there is much room for improvement. Consider the ruling by Parliament's presiding officers to ban facial coverings in the building's public galleries. This ruling, had it stood, would have created a form of religious segregation in our federal parliament. It would have treated those who wear items of religious clothing, such as the niqab, like second-class citizens. Like I suspect everyone here, I welcomed the decision earlier this week to reverse that interim ruling. But let's be honest, the original burqa ruling should never have been made. In the first place, the burqa is something that is only rarely seen in Australia. Here, the most common form of covering worn by Muslim women is the hijab, the headscarf. The niqab, it's a full veil which leaves the eyes of the wearer visible, is not commonly worn. Whether some have managed to confuse the burqa with the niqab, or even the hijab, I think remains unclear. And if there were security issues about face coverings at Parliament, this seems most easily resolved by some common sense. Namely, screening as opposed to segregation. It's worth noting that New South Wales has had for several years laws that require people to identify themselves when called upon. Laws that Muslim Australians in New South Wales have accepted without rancour. To date, I'm not aware of any expert or authoritative advice that the burqa or niqab represents a security threat that's distinctive from any other item of clothing. But in more general terms, community harmony does appear to be coming under some serious challenge. In recent months, Muslim and Arab communities have been making clear to me that they are deeply concerned about rising numbers of attacks against their members. People have physically assaulted others in anti-Muslim attacks. People have been threatened and abused in public places. Mosques have been defaced. One message today must get through. It is wrong to judge entire communities based on the actions of extremist minorities. In the case of Islamic extremism, ISIL and its supporters are not representative of Islam. For example, the Deputy Commissioner of Police in New South Wales, Nick Cowles, has made very clear that there is a clear link between criminal elements and radicals within Sydney's Muslim community. It's just worth reminding people at that point, because the overwhelming majority of Muslim Australians do not subscribe to the abhorrent ideologies associated with ISIL. As with all members of our community, Muslims are entitled to fair treatment. But there are signs now that anti-Muslim bigotry is not being confined just to Muslim Australians. It's now spilling over into other communities. Sikh Australians, to name but one, have said that they are now becoming targets of racial abuse because they've been mistaken for supposed Muslim extremists. That there may be a racial element to anti-Muslim sentiment is, in my view, indisputable, unquestionable. What's troubling, though, is to find that those rehearsing anti-Muslim bigotry are increasingly hiding behind semantics. I get letters every day. Letters or posts on Facebook or messages on Twitter, but some will say that suggestions about anti-Muslim feeling being racist involves a confusion. Why? Because Islam, they say, is not a race. People will say that anti-Muslim behaviour has nothing to do with matters of racial discrimination because Muslims do not constitute a racial or ethnic group. Yet it's clear that hostility against Muslims can involve a racial dimension, and often it does. On the one hand, attacks on the basis of religion can be used as a surrogate for racial abuse and harassment. On the other, particular racial and ethnic identities are being commonly associated with the Islamic religion. Race and religion cannot be neatly divorced from one another on this issue. But whether it's based on race or religion, I think we could do with just one basic principle. Bigotry and nastiness, whatever form it takes, warrants our condemnation. Let me wrap up. On matters of race, the negatives, the challenges can appear overwhelming. Progress must always be fought for, but often it can be done by moments, opportunism, or recklessness. Yet there are sources of encouragement. People are standing up to racism, and they're doing it in increasing numbers. This is something we encourage through the Racism It Stops With Me initiative that we lead at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and of which the Castan Centre is a supporter. And I do want to take this opportunity tonight to thank everyone at the Castan Centre for their support for our work at the Commission. You know, it's instructive that Castan was one of the earliest supporters of Racism It Stops With Me. And that speaks of how the Centre is indeed a model for engaged scholarship, for how research and teaching on human rights can shape its practice. And I can tell you this, it's very hard for me not to notice the Centre's impact. The work of the Centre is ubiquitous. I can't walk down a few metres in the corridors of the Human Rights Commission without spotting on some desks that unmistakable heft of Sarah Joseph and Melissa Castan's book on the ICCPR. It seems to me as well that about 1 in 3 or 4 policy officers have some connection to the Castan Centre, whether that's as research associates or as students. And on any matter of public policy, whether that's national security, immigration or free speech, again, the Centre staff are making valuable submissions and contributions. It's a testament to your leadership that so many of the human rights community have come out tonight, and I do hope that everyone will be generous in your support for Sarah and her colleagues. But let me conclude finally on a note of reflection. This week has been one for all of us who are friends of social justice and human rights to mourn the passing of Gough Whitlam and to celebrate his achievements. We have lost a titan. He once said that among Fabians he was Fabian Maximus, but here was our progressive Maximus. Prime Minister whose government completed the work of ending the White Australia policy, whose government opened Australia to Asia, embraced multiculturalism, and introduced the Racial Discrimination Act, this country's first federal human rights legislation. Claire, you may have your stories about Tony Jones, but I think just about everyone this week has had a story to share about Gough Whitlam. I'm afraid I only met him once, when I was an awestruck teenager. But as someone who grew up in Western Sydney, I was surrounded by Whitlam. I was surrounded by things called Whitlam. I grew up reading at the E.G. Whitlam Library in Cabramatta. My cricket team's ground was named Whitlam Park. My local swimming pool was the Whitlam Leisure Centre. And there was a reason we named everything after this man in that part of Sydney. It was because he was, in every sense, an enlarger of our life. A man who made Australia a bigger place. I can imagine hearing his imperious voice urging encouragement on all of us tonight. Because, friends, there is much for us to do in defending human rights. There is much for us to do in ensuring we see the best of our country. There is every reason for us to maintain our rage and our enthusiasm. Thank you very much.